Talk today about the continuation of the story that we started yesterday. And in this lecture, we're going to look at the events which occurred after the catastrophe. Every catastrophe has two phases. Number one, you have the development of the layers and everything during the flood. And then after the flood, you have the reverse, when you have the waters pouring off the land, the continents being lifted up again. So you have the reverse effect. So yesterday we dealt with this part of the geological column where you have most of these fossils, and we started talking about dinosaurs and creatures like this, and I showed you insects and fish and trees and all kinds of fossils like that. Today I'm going to talk about these top layers, the Cenozoic layers, and we're talking about the tertiary and the quaternary. That's where we find most of the mammals and the birds. And very interesting, between these layers, between these Mesozoic layers and these Cenozoic layers, there is a layer which is called Cretaceous. Now in German it's called Kreide, which means chalk. And chalk is an interesting deposit because chalk is accumulated from the calcium carbonate shells of unicellular animals or algae. And so the question is, why do we have this chalk layer at that level over there? Now, one of the best places to see this chalk layer is, of course, if you go to the White Cliffs of Dover. There you have this massive chalk deposit. And this raises a number of questions as to how did it get there, what are the time implications for it to be there. And one would assume that to lay down a layer like that of chalk would take a long period of time. But today we know that if you have pollution circumstances like in the Mediterranean Sea, you can get massive algal deposition. If you have a disturbed ecology, if you had the fountains of the great deep burst forth and put huge quantities of minerals into the water, you would create exactly the conditions that are required for algal blooms. So we're not talking millions of years here, we're talking periods of relatively short chronology, maybe even talking about hundreds rather than thousands. And the White Cliffs of Dover are areas where this chalk deposit is quite thick. In other areas, the chalk deposit is very thin, but it is universal, and that tells us that everything was underwater at the same time. Continent, 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 everywhere, everything was underwater at the same time. Now, if it is thin, it tells us what? If the layer was thin, it tells us that it wasn't underwater very long. If it's thick, it tells us that it was underwater for a longer period of time. And it's interesting that if you correlate history, you will see that these islands, for example, have not been populated for thousands and thousands of years. Everything is fairly recent history. In other areas, of course, where Ararat was, it would have come up relatively quickly. So you don't have that long period of time. This is typically what it looks like under a microscope. You have these calcium carbonate shells over here of these algal blooms that you had. If you go to the coasts of Spain, for example, you have a lot of these little unicellular shells of these little unicellular organisms in the seas called foraminifera. Lots of evidence for tremendous blooms of these organisms. Now I'm going to take you to an interesting place. This is the famous Bighorn Basin, where you have the Bighorn Mountains and the Beartooth Mountains. And I just want to run this by you just for a while. Think upon this. Imagine that you're taking these mountain tops right down to their previous level. and you're taking that one down to its previous level. So there are no mountains, everything is flat. You flatten it out. And you cover the earth with these layers that formed during the flood, as we explained it yesterday. Then you would find the following. These layers down here, which I've coded as red, are the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic layers. Those are the same ones you'd find in the Grand Canyon, for example. Here they are, and imagine that that is down at that level, and everything is flat, and they're covering the whole bit. Now, after the event, you have uplift. And so this Beartooth Mountain range gets lifted up. Up it goes. What happens to the water that's on top of it? It'll cascade down into the valley. Now, if you look at the layers along these mountain ranges and in this valley, you will see, interestingly, that they are folded up on the sides, like that. You see that? What does that tell you? It tells you that those layers were there when this mountain was uplifted. Is that right? And it tells you that they were soft. Or else what would happen if they were solid sheets of rock? They would just break up into blocks, right? So they were soft when they were uplifted. And on the other side over here. But this side must have come up quite quickly because we have a fault here, which is called the Beartooth Fault, which is a tear in the earth. A tear. So it went up very quickly, and it moved these layers up, and this side also came up, but probably slightly slower, and you'll see the warp is not quite as great. Up it goes, and you have this basin then. Now, if you look at the green layers, what are they? Are they folded up on the sides, yes or no? So what does that tell you? That they weren't there when the mountain was uplifted, is that right? Why? Because else they would also have been folded up on the sides. Are you with me? Okay. So these layers are the young layers. And what are they covering up? Well, obviously, they are covering up whatever was floating on the top of these layers before they were formed. So I would like to suggest that these deposits are the deposits in the reverse of the flood. So when the mountain ranges and the continents came up and the water cascaded down into these valleys, it buried what was in those layers. So these layers actually are recycled material. And if you look up top there sits a mountain. And it's called Beartooth Butte. And it's a very strange little mountain because it is of the same rock material as those layers down there. Now, science has a problem because they say that all of this took how long? Millions and millions and millions of years. And the question is, why is that little mountain sitting up there? How did it get there? You see, if the age of this material is very old, like they say it is, because it's from this bottom material, they have a problem that it's now some 10,000 feet higher than the rest of its pals who are down there. How do you get it up there? Well, they have to develop means of getting that piece up there. And they use thrusting. So they push it uphill by forces, tectonic forces or whatever. They thrust it up there until it sits up there. Major problem. There's no evidence that it ever was thrusted. There are no push lines. There's no breakup. How do you get this whole mountain? There it is. It's a pretty neat little piece of rock sitting right over there. It looks like it's always been quite happy there, doesn't it? All right, so how did it get there? If I go back to that previous slide, let me suggest that these layers were covering everything. They were on the top there as well. If you take that down in your mind's eye, everything was covered. Now you're pushing it up. What happens to the water? It goes from left to right, down into the valley. Is that right? And it goes from this side down into the valley. And before this was washed away, also, what happened? The water was gone. So it's a relic of the flood. That would explain it. All right, now these Cenozoic layers, these ones over here, are actually, if you go into the paleontology, burial sites. They are graveyards. And this is something very hard to explain by the scientific fraternity. By the way, these mountains all get their name from that little peak over there, which is the Bear Tooth. And I thought that was quite cute, so I just put it there for fun. It's not important at all. All right, look at that. These are the tertiary deposits. Those layers in the top there, those young ones. And what do you see in them? You see them jam-packed with bone chips of mammals. So here was the scenario. The floodwaters covered the earth. There was huge quantity of floating debris, dead animals, bloated animals floating all over. Some of them floating quite long. Some of them, where it came up quickly, floating less time. And the burial was quite recent. In other areas where it came up later, they would have been quite decayed already. So I would assume that if you find something like this, bone chips of different animals, all broken up, that tells you something about catastrophism. But what does that tell you? In these tertiary deposits, you find sometimes graveyards of thousands of animals, all dumped together, all different kinds of animals, dumped together in a mass grave. Now, surely that is not chance fossilization over millions of years. Would you agree? That's catastrophism. That's a burial site. So these animals are now being buried. Now, if you have huge quantities of algal material, fish deposits, all these deposits and these organic materials have quite a few floats in them to keep them floating, some of the algae, so they're rich in oil. If you're burying them, that makes for a perfect solution to create the oils and the asphalts and the tars and the things that we have on our planet today. The tertiary, these young layers at the top are also, if you look at the mollusks in them, evidence for stream orientation. Can you see that they're lying in the same direction, just as the trees? So this is catastrophism. This isn't stability over millions of years with chance fossilization. You even get green leaves buried. Now, that is very strange, because this means that new plants were stripped and then buried. But the Bible has a solution to that as well. It talks about a great wind. So if you have a wet environment, and you have seeds in that environment, and the salt water drains, and the fresh water from rain comes on top of them, then that seed can germinate, even if it has been buried for more than a year, 2 years. It's like putting a seed in a granary. Because when you put a seed in a granary, you're keeping it dry. Putting it into seawater keeps it dry too, because the salt concentration outside is greater than the salt concentration inside, and by the laws of osmosis, that will withdraw the water from the seed, so the seed in seawater is perfectly dry, basically. That's what it boils down to. Then you take it out, and you put fresh water on it, and it will germinate. So you could have had new growth coming very, very quickly. It just takes a few days for plants to sprout and to grow and to carry on and make grass coverings first, and the first shoots of olive trees and all these stuff. I have no problem with any of that. And then there was a period of drying, so you would have lots of burial of green material as well. That's what it looked like on Spirit Lake after St. Helens exploded. And you can see all the debris lying over there. Now imagine it mixed up with animals and floating creatures. If you go along the ancient coastlines of Europe, you will find that all the brown coal deposits are all along those ancient coastlines. That's a mass burial of a huge quantity of floating plant material. That's basically what it boils down to. We have evidence of a very wet world. These young deposits at the top are full of algal deposits, like algal fossil beds, like you have them over there. There are water ferns. There are mangrove swamp ferns, little fish. So you would have lots of post-catastrophic catastrophes. So a lot of the lifting of the continent would cause inland seas to break up and lakes to form and to break open with the movement. So you'd have lots of little catastrophes taking place. Here are some dragonfly nests fossilized in that area, and some beautiful insect deposits as well. And we know something about the temperature. If you go to Europe, you will find fossils like this in Europe. Here is the beechwood, and there is the fossil leaf, there's the living form. And here you have the certain butterflies. If they're in the fossil, they say it's a different species, but it's exactly the same as the thing that lives today. And here you have Persian ironwood. And there's the fossil, and there's the living one. So these are in these top layers. So this early growth that you had was such that Persian ironwood was perfectly happy in Europe. That means that the temperature there was much higher than it is today, because this plant cannot grow there today. It needs a very hot environment. Now, where do we get the heat from? Well, let me put it to you this way. After the flood waters came and the fountains of the great deep burst forth, some of those subterranean waters are at very high temperatures. 360 degrees are the thermal vents of today. Because of the high pressure of the oceans, they have this high temperature, and they come out from under the ground at very high temperatures. Now mix the fountains with the waters above that rain down. What would that do in terms of ocean temperature? Would you imagine that we could have had warm ocean temperatures? What do warm oceans do to the climate? They make the climate warm. So you have very warm, wet environments. Now that is perfect for regeneration. So the whole world, post-flood, must have been tropical. Warm oceans, lots of evaporation, lots of moisture, and the warm oceans tell us that there was no ice, there were no ice ages, none of that existed. Evidence for ice ages other than the one ice age at the end could just as well have been turbidite activity, because they measure it on stones being dragged along, but a turbidite and a mud flow will drag stones just as well as ice. So the only real evidence is for one ice age and no more. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. Great evidence on top of the earth for huge inland lakes. If you take Lake Lohantan, or the remnant of that is Great Salt Lake, if you take the whole of the Sahara, everything seems to have been one huge freshwater lake at some stage. This one is very interesting. If you look at the lakes, then there are scientists that will tell you that the lakes cannot only be 4,000 to 5,000 years old, because they have what they call year rings. There are mud layers which they say are deposited annually. So when it starts raining, whenever there's a rainy season there's a mud layer deposited, and another one, and another one, and another one. And sometimes you have up to 40,000 of these layers in the wall of a lake. So they say that is 40,000 years. So how do you want to fit 40,000 years into a short time frame? That was the problem. These layers are called varves. But I'd like you to look at this interesting leaf in varves in one of the lakes, buried over here, and we'll count them. You can see them from the bottom there. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It gets a bit difficult here, 14, 15, without a very clear picture. But when we count them all to the top of the leaf, it comes to about 35, 36 varves. You must agree that that's a pretty tough leaf, right? Waiting 36 years to be buried. Or else the valves don't take a year to form. And so new studies show that valves form like this. A wind can cause a valve. Whatever can cause a valve. Fossils in the tertiary are absolutely astounding. But everything is perfect. For example, these bats. So the earth was repopulated with bats. Some of these go and sit in limestone caves. The earth is readjusting, the limestone caves collapse, and you have these animals buried in those limestone caves. So we have great fossils of this time. And you know what is interesting? They are all bigger and larger and better than you and I. Everything was big. If you go to the elephants, you go to the giant mastodons, they were massive. If you go to the tigers, they were massive. If you go to the bison, they were massive. Any animal you take, it was bigger in the past than it is today. What is that, evolution or devolution? Now, how many million years does it take for an animal to go from big to small? Does it take 1 million years? Well, it's very interesting. You can read this up in the journal Nature. They have a whole article on it. And of course, not from this viewpoint at all, but it doesn't matter. It's great to use. Where they say that if you take animals and you put them onto an island, let's say you take whatever, deer, whatever, put them onto an island. And the island, if it is small enough, will create tremendous competition for resources. And one of the ways animals cope with competition for resources is to try and use less of the resources. How do you do that? You become smaller. A small animal has a higher metabolic rate, but it eats less than a big animal. So if you are smaller, then there is more food to go around. So within a few generations, the animals can actually, on these island situations, go from their original size to 1/3 their original size. So they just shrink down. So the deer that used to be that size will be that size after a couple of generations. Isn't that incredible? If you take human beings and you have not a very good diet, a slightly impoverished diet, only grains or something like that, you get very small people. What did the Japanese look like before the war? If you look at the old cartoons, you will see that the military cartoons, they will have the American standing over there, and then they'll have the Japanese standing on a box, and still not reaching to the shoulders of the American. That's how they used to depict them in the war, to show how small they were. Today, well, 6 foot, no problem. The other question we would like to ask, if this is so, then how come we have such perfect fossils if it was such a short chronology? Surely it takes a couple of million years for the fossils to form. Doesn't it take a long time for an animal to turn to stone or something like that? Well, this is a very interesting hat. Do you like it? Yeah, I think it's cool. I wouldn't mind wearing a hat like that. Only trouble with this hat is that it'll be a little bit heavy. It's in one of the museums of one of the mines in Australia. Because you see, what happened was there was an abandoned mine that hadn't been used for a couple of years. And then someone went down to investigate the mine, and they found the hat of one of the miners down in the mine. And this is it. And it's in the museum. Only problem is, it's turned to solid stone. It's a fossil. It's a fossil hat. So this felt hat has turned to stone. How many million years is it old? So you see, it doesn't take long to form the fossils. So we've seen that we have these huge animals, and it doesn't take long for them to have a reduction in size. If you look at the paleontology books, that's what you'll see. You'll see these weird and strange and wonderful creatures talking about these young layers. And they'll have the giant mastodon over there, and they'll have this giant creature over here, the giant sloth strolling around, and they'll have the giant bison and the giant saber-toothed tiger and the giant this and the giant... Have you noticed the common word is the giant? Everything is bigger and better. And of course, weird and wonderful world, millions and millions of years ago. They'll date this at about 40 million years ago. 40 million years ago. By the way, when did man start evolving according to the theory? Well, some say about 2.5 million years ago. 2.5 million years ago. You see, you have a problem. If you start with 2 people and you use today's growth rate, which is about 1.87%, and you start with just 2 people, how long before you have today's population? 1,200 years. So you have a major problem. You have to have a couple of wars and a couple of disasters and a couple of destructions to get rid of all the people. We should have had them over and over and over again, the number that we have today. And by the way, they didn't start with 2. Noah had 3 sons. So it must have been even quicker. And they were married too, isn't that right? Okay, all right. So questions. How long ago did animals look weird and wonderful? And why did they look weird and wonderful? Well, the answer is that if you look at the size, we've already discussed this, but there's a beetle that grows in a poor season with poor rainfall, and the same species is this size in a good season. So today, animals adapt very quickly to size. I'm going to take you to Labrie tar pits. Who's been there? Some of you should have been there. All right. I stood here and waited. People think I'm a bit nuts, you see, but they don't know what I'm waiting for. I stood here and waited for what you see over there. Can you see it? Where the arrow is? What is that? That's a bubble. That's a bubble. I mean, would you stand there and wait at the Labrie tar pits for a bubble to appear? And when the bubble appears and you photograph it and you know that, well, the bubble's gone and I probably haven't got that one, so you photograph the next bubble and the next one until your whole film is gone just in case you didn't get the bubble. I mean, they would put you away, right? They would think you're slightly odd. Well, that's what I did. Why did I want to get that bubble? Well, you see, the tar comes from the layers underneath where all this organic material had formed tar, and pressure builds up above from the rotting process. That's what fermentation is all about. And then you get this pressure of gas, and the gas pressure pushes it up through cracks in the ground, and it bubbles out at the top. So you have these fissures where the tar comes out, but it's still bubbling. Did you see the bubble? Yes. Okay, it's still bubbling. Now, if I put a hole into the top of a Coke bottle, put a hole in it, how long before my Coke gets flat? Will it take 1,000,000 years? Okay, it won't take 1,000,000 years. Now, rock, is it porous, yes or no? Yes. Yeah. So could gas escape through it eventually, yes or no? So how long is this Coke bottle still bubbling with all these holes in the cap? Can you see that this tar cannot be millions of years old? If you draw oil, what happens if you strike it? Why? Because the Coke is not flat yet. Are you with me? So if it's not flat, how many millions of years old is it with all the holes in the bottle cap? Good question. Okay. Here, you have this tar on the top. The animals that have spread across the globe come and they walk on this tar. They get trapped in the tar. They start sinking down. They yell and scream and whatever. And the predators come. And this is what they will show you. The saber-toothed tiger, the weird and the wonderfuls, all there. If you ever go to Labrie, go and look at the one wall, and you will see that they have tigers that they dug out there with tiny little teeth to that size. So these are the extremes of the range. So if you have a new world, and there is not much competition on this world, and everything is perfect on this world with lots of lush growth, animals can repopulate very quickly, you will get tremendous variety. Only when the going gets tough do you cut down through selection those varieties that have a selective disadvantage. Are you with me? So in other words, those are extremes of the range. What about these animals? Are they really so weird and wonderful, or are they just elephants? What about this one over here? This is the giant sloth. That's its actual size. In a recent, who's heard of Richard Attenborough? Have you seen the Richard Attenborough series? Very evolutionary series. Well, he has a little clip on there where he talks about these creatures and where they found skins of them still intact, whole skins, still leather, make jackets of them, what have you, in caves in South America. So they actually started thinking, well, maybe these creatures were still around a couple of 100 years ago, not millions of years ago. And there are people who think they're still around and are looking for them in the jungles down there. Well, they haven't found them yet. So it's not such a wonderful and weird world, but everything was bigger and everything was better. And what they show you as strange and wonderful are often the extremes of the ranges. They don't show you the whole picture. This is the dire wolf, just bigger than today's. All right. Now, if the animals from the ark, think about this, if the animals from the ark could repopulate the earth, then the land bridges between the continents must still have been there, right or wrong? Otherwise, how did they get across? The land bridges. How did they get from one continent to another, right? Could the continents have been totally separated after the flood, yes or no? No, otherwise the animals wouldn't have been able to get across. Does that make sense? So something must have happened after the flood before the continents fully broke up. Is that correct? And we also have a world today where there is ice and snow and sleet. Is that right? So something must have changed and brought about ice and snow and sleet. Is that correct? Is it possible to get the populations of animals that we have today in the time frame available? That's another question. Now we've dealt with that. We've talked about the human beings. How long would it take, did I say? Just 1,200 years to get today's population starting with 2. If I had elephants, they have a longer gestation period, but a shorter generation period. There could be, after 300 years, there could be 6 million elephants on this earth. 6 million elephants. It takes 76 years, we have evidence of that in Australia, from one pair of rabbits to get billions of rabbits. Rabbits are very good at multiplying. How long does it take for mice? Very quickly. How long does it take for them to migrate? Well, we used to think millions of years. Forget it. Today we know that when a new animal hits a continent, within 70 years it can move from the top to the bottom, even if it's as small as a mouse. So it doesn't take millions of years. So imagine now this planet. I don't know what the time frame is. I cannot even guess what the time frame is. I have a couple of clues maybe. But we're talking here post-flood, maybe 150 years post-flood. Animals have started to repopulate the world. As I said, it takes 80 years for a mouse to have traveled from the tip of Africa, the bottom of Africa, all the way around Europe, right down through America to the tip of the bottom of America, South America. So it doesn't take, we don't need a long time here. So the animals are repopulating the earth. Human beings are basically located around Mesopotamia and that area. And then something happens. Remember, the oceans are warm, and suddenly you have meteoric impact, like you cannot believe. Any evidence? Oh yeah, lots of it. You have the giant impact craters all over the planet. You have the impact crater in Arizona, but where is it? It's on top. Is that right? So it's a recent phenomenon. And it cannot be millions of years old because erosion should have filled it in by now already or done something to it. But it's perfect. You have the giant impact craters along all the break lines of Africa. You have the impact craters along Namibia. You have the impact craters all around Siberia. In fact, the entire basin of the Siberian area is probably a huge impact crater. In fact, all of these areas would suddenly break up. And what would that result in? Well, let's say the continent was a supercontinent before the flood, and then it started breaking up, and then the impact craters came, and then everything broke up and spread apart. Then continental drift must have been quite a recent phenomenon. And if you look at the maps of the world, especially if you go along the, not the coastline, but the subterranean, the sub-water coastline, the continents fit like a puzzle. And if you look over here, the mid-Atlantic ridge, you have all this huge volcanic activity. If you go around the Ring of Fire, you have huge volcanic activity. So all of a sudden, boom, thousands of volcanoes go off at the same time. Now, one volcano, Mount St. Helens, and that was a Mickey Mouse volcano. Although it was in America, it was a Mickey Mouse. Well, Mickey Mouse also comes from America, so it doesn't really matter, right? It dropped the world's temperature by 1 degree centigrade. Krakatoa was 4 times as powerful, dropped the world temperature by 4 degrees centigrade. Now what would thousands of volcanoes going off at the same time do? It put so much dust in the air that the world's temperature would drop dramatically. By the way, look how perfectly the puzzle still fits. And I'll tell you, coastlines are eroding at such an enormous pace that the puzzle shouldn't fit at all anymore. We have lots of evidence. If you just go up here to Washington State and all these areas, lots of evidence of recent volcanism because it's all on the top. Lots of volcanic activity. All those volcanic dikes up there in the mountain ranges. Look at the rapid rate of coastal erosion. This is in Australia. So that the continents still fit shows recent chronology. I mean, really phenomenal erosion that we have in some areas of the world. So the coastline shows recent. You have the breakup, splits up, and you have this huge volcanic dust cloud. And the sun is shielded. You have warm oceans, lots of evaporation from the oceans, southern cold. What does that do? Boom! Instant ice age. You get so much snow, so much ice, so much cold, you don't even know what's happening. And the interesting thing is, with this rapid evaporation from the warm oceans, you would get glaciers coming in onto the land. But what about the coastlines? What would the temperature be along a coastline with the water still warm? Would be temperate. So now you can start understand why mastodons can be in the north of Siberia, above Siberia, in the north, perfectly happy and alive. What were they eating up there if there was only ice and snow and sleet like there is today? They were living along the coastline, and they were living on the islands, and they were eating what was growing there luxuriously even during the Ice Age. And the glaciers cut the elephant populations in two, and across the land, those in the north were along the coastlines warm. Those in the south, the relics are the Indian elephants that we have today. Two populations. You also in America cut them into two, southern and northern groups. And there they were, separated, but quite happy. And how long was the glacial period? Science would have us believe 100,000 years. Impossible. There are 50 theories at least trying to explain how a glacier can grow and grow and grow if it gets slowly colder and colder. It's impossible. Because the colder it gets, the less evaporation you have. So you can only have this type of thing happening if you have warm oceans, lots of evaporation, sudden cold, boom, you would have an ice age. And studies at Athabasca Glacier over here in Canada, you can go there, you can check it out for yourself, you can walk on that glacier. If you're nuts like I am, you will do that. And some other people, as you see, are also nuts. You can walk on here. If you slip and fall into a glacial river, goodbye, that's the end of you. Nobody will ever find you again. There's one of those glacial rivers. Down it goes under the glacier, and you'll be gone forever. So it's not a very wise thing to do, but nevertheless, here you can see some markers that the scientists have put up. And these are year markers, 1982, 1980, 1970, whatever, and down it goes all the way down there. They used to think that glaciation would take 100,000 years. But from studies at Athabasca and at glacial bed F22, they know that complete glaciation, deglaciation, 600 years max. Do we read anything about ice and snow and sleet in the Bible? Have you read the book of Job? Can you see what Job talks about? Ice and snow and sleet and cold and all those good things? Now, where does he get it from? It's not there like that at the moment. So I believe he lived in this time, and that this period of this massive ice accumulation was quite short after the flood and lasted a short period of time, couple of 100 years. And we know that glacial valleys are U-shaped. Can you see them? So this has been cut out by a glacier. Water valleys are what? Do you remember? What a great class. I'm proud of you. All right, here's some nice glacial rivers, glacial lakes. You can see everything is U-shaped, cut out by the glaciers. Then you can have post-glaciation catastrophe, like here at Columbia Dry Falls. what is happening over here is quite interesting, because for long periods of time scientists said this also took millions of years. But now they have to admit, and this is their own placard, Story of Dry Falls, and it says over here, they bear stark witness to the tremendous power of catastrophic floods that swept over eastern Washington at the end of the last ice age. Of course, they got the time wrong over there, 20 million years, but never mind that. They're at least admitting to catastrophism. So you had this glacier cut off a lake, and when the glacier started receding and broke open under the pressure of the water, you have this huge body of water cut out this tremendous dry fall area, and then the glacial water was gone, and the problem was solved. All right, so these mastodons lived in the north, cut off from the south, not millions of years ago, but relatively recently. Now, because they were so big, and because they were so woolly, scientists put their age at something like 40 million years ago that they roamed the earth. And then, oops, they found spears in them. Oops. Recalculate. So they have them living closer to the dawn of man, which they put at how many million years ago? At about 2.5 million years ago. And so they have man down there at the bottom with his spear hunting the woolly mammoth. If you go to the caves of the world, if you go to France, what is that on the cave wall? That's a woolly mammoth. Now you know what? Caves are supposed to drip and cover up and grow and cover, yes or no? And in millions of years, everything that was drawn against the wall should be covered up or eradicated, right or wrong. These drawings are perfect. Absolutely perfect. In fact, in Africa, where these millions of years old cave drawings in the deserts of the world, you find them against the walls, having been there for millions of years, but in the last 100 years since they have been discovered, they're disappearing so quickly that they're now all protected. Isn't that strange? How did they survive so long if they're disappearing so quickly? So man and these animals were contemporaneous. What is more, they're taking them out over there, out of the ice, and they made steaks of them, fed them to the dogs. Human beings ate the flesh of mastodons. And I wondered to myself, 40 million year old steak and still edible? By the way, the humans got slight diarrhea. That was it. That was the only problem. The dogs didn't bother at all. They asked for more. So how did it happen that these animals got buried in ice? There they were in the north, beautifully walking around these warm oceans. By the way, we know the oceans were warm and that the glaciers were there. Have you heard of disharmonious fossil assemblages? That's when animals are together that shouldn't be together. That's a disharmony, right? So in England, you will find fossils of reindeer with hippopotamus together. Does that make any sense? None whatsoever. And crocodile. So the glaciers were pushing the reindeer south, but it was warm enough along the oceans for hippopotami and crocodiles to live together. Now, when the ice melts after the ice age, and we saw how quickly glaciers recede, so it doesn't take millions of years, suddenly you have an exponential ice melt. And you have huge bodies of cold, fresh water flowing out onto the ocean. And this water is less dense than seawater. Does that make sense to you? Fresh water is less dense than seawater. So it makes a layer on top. And then at night it gets cold, and what happens to that water? It freezes. So when the ice of the glaciers started melting, that's when the big freeze in the north took place. And instantly, those oceans that had preserved life up there formed an ice layer over the top, and they were frozen over. These animals suddenly were cut off virtually in a short period of time from their food source. Everything froze over with a melt, not with a forming, with a melt stage. And so They had to move from place to place. And everything was ice, and they were heavy, so they would crash in and they'd get buried in the ice. And that is why they are there. But how many millions of years can they be old if you can still eat the flesh? And there is an embryo of one of them, perfectly preserved. They are not as old as we would have them believe. So we see how science changes its mind. 40 million years, boom! Just cut those millions out and put them contemporaneous with man to fit in with the new facts. Time and again, we are confronted with this issue of the evolution of man. Here is an old-time magazine. Its title is How Man Began. Here is a newer time magazine. Its title is How Man Began. And every time you have these ape-like creatures over there. And I'd like you to look at this so-called ancestor. Can you see all the scratch marks on his face? And all the blood and smeared all over his face. Now why? Why did they put that image up there? You see, it's the mindset. It's not unfair. This is their mindset. This is how they think. This is how I used to think. Obviously, in the past, everything was primitive and less advanced than it is today. Is that right? So they were fighting and clawing and scratching and eking out a living by whacking each other over the head and living that way. So they were vicious, primitive creatures. That's what the world believes. And out of that, you must go to something advanced. Let's have a look at some of the evidence. No scientist says that man evolved from the apes. We used to ridicule creation scientists because they used to use this as a frame, as a forum. We didn't come from the apes. No scientist says that. The apes and man are common descendants of a common ancestor. Are you with me? Your real ancestor is this little guy down there, the tree shrew. Meet your ancestor. That's what he looked like. And he changed over time, and his eyes, instead of being on the side, moved to the front, like this creature up there, this primate, where the eyes are in the front, apparently to judge distance better. Although this guy never makes a mistake when he jumps, somehow they think that is what happened. And then the brain developed, and that's when the primates started developing. And eventually the primates came down from the trees. They were arboreal, they lived in the trees. Then they came down, and they had a total change of diet. They were quite happy with bananas and leaves, but then they developed a liking for the buck and the deer and what have you in the plains, took a club, clobbered them to death, and started eating meat. So they say. So there was a change in diet. And the theory, the popular theory is that man has his cradle in Africa, and this is called the out of Africa theory, and spread to the rest this way. On the other hand, also in the very same textbooks, you will find what is called the multi-regional hypothesis, that man sort of developed contemporaneously with some of the others and didn't really have a particular cradle. So the evidence is obviously confusing enough to say, now hang on a second, did he come out of here? Did he come out of Asia? And all kinds of arguments surrounding this issue. Let's have a look at some of the evidence. Firstly, get it into your minds that man did not evolve from the apes. The apes and man are end products of some unknown previous ancestor. Are you with me? All the fossils that they use to show the lineage of man were also contemporaneous with man. Are you with me? So there's no such thing as any fossil that they are using as an example of one that existed before man existed. They are all contemporaneous. So they know that they're not on the line, but they're using them as an example. They're saying, I know that this creature lived at the same time as man, but he has possible features common to the common ancestor. That's very, very important that we realize that. So the old world monkeys, the new world monkeys, man were there at the same time. Remember that yesterday we saw that all the creatures were basically, all the phyla were there from the beginning. Another point is creatures like Australopithecus, the in-between ones, they were also contemporaneous with man. Now let's get to the story. Some will say this is a primitive primate. Why? Because it looks primitive. That's the only basic thing. And this is an advanced primate. Why? Because it looks more like man. This is not a criterion. Or this is an advanced primate, the orangutan. But the ape-like ones and the man-like ones were contemporaneous. They lived at the same time. Yet, we are to believe that you went from the haunched gait to the upright gait. And somehow, in that, freed the hands, and this made for greater intelligence, and what have you. Now let's have a look at what the various groups say. This is Louis Leakey over here. He's of course dead now, but his whole protege are the ones that are carrying on with this work. Their ancestor is this one over there. Australopithecus is the one. Australopithecus, pithecus means ape. So this is an ape. But they say that this ape, although he lived together with modern man already, has features that were probably in between sort of the really modern apes and man. And then they take him through various lines of Pithecanthropus erectus and Homo erectus to Neanderthalensis over there, Neanderthal man, and then Cro-Magnon man over there. That's their lineage. And their most famous fossils were found at Olduvai Gorge, and all of them are either 100% ape or they are 100% hominid, human-like. This one over here, Olduvai Bed 2, they find this famous skull, which is skull 1470 from the Kenya Museum. There it is. That is the ultimate in-between fossil. That's what they've got of him. That's it. And they say the skull is 100% ape. No doubt, he's an ape. No doubt. But he probably walked upright, so they say. Why? Because you find footprints at Olduvai of human-type footprints, and they say that they were made by Australopithecus. Now, problem. Humans and Australopithecus, were they contemporaneous, yes or no? In fact, in Olduvai Bed 2, they find the skulls. In Olduvai Bed 1, which is older, they find remains of human huts. So who was there before? Humans were around. So who says those footprints are ape footprints? Who says they're not human footprints? In fact, they have all the features of human footprints. In fact, they are human footprints, but they want them to be something else. And there is no other complete fossil to make it anything else. So there are many scientists who are saying Australopithecus is just another ape. By the way, they have different species of Australopithecus. You get very sophisticated. You have Australopithecus robustus, which means the robust one, the tough one. He had a ridge on the top. Then you have Australopithecus africanus, the one who comes from Africa. Then you have Australopithecus afarensis, the one who comes from far. And they're all different species. Did you know that male gorillas have a ridge and female gorillas don't have a prominent ridge? Does that make them two species? But when you find them in the fossils, it certainly does make them two species. Well, this is Johansen. Johansen is the next one to bring evidence for the Australopithecus line, but he has another source. His most famous fossil is this one over here. She's called Lucy. You've all heard of Lucy? Lucy is no beaut, as you see, but anyway, she is the ancestor type, according to him, but contemporaneous with man already. Have you all got that? Okay. Now this is his fossil. The head over there is 100% ape. You cannot change it. He says that the arm to leg ratio is halfway between that of man and the apes. Now in man, the arm is 75% the length of the leg. The leg is longer than the arm. All right? So the ratio is 1 to 0.75. In an ape, the leg is as long as the arm. So the ratio is 1 to 1. Lucy has a ratio, if I remember correctly, of 1 to 0.87. that's nicely in between the man and the apes. But if you look at the fossil, there's a big chunk of the arm missing over there. There's a big piece missing over there. By the way, there's a piece missing over there as well. There's a femur. The other femur is not there. The tibia is not there. There's a huge chunk missing over there. How do you calculate 0.87? You know, I'd like to have his computer. It can do more than mine can. So let's forget about the ratio. You can't tell. So another bit of evidence, he talks about the hip. Now there's the hip. The hip, he says, is such that Lucy walked upright and not like this. She walked upright. Question. Is it with this hip that she walked upright? Well, not quite. You see, this hip is 100% ape. In fact, with that hip, Lucy walked like this, like apes do. So why does he say that the hip is actually an evidence for upright gait? Well, he says the hip got twisted during fossilization. But you see, there's only one hip, so you can't see whether it was twisted because the other one's gone. All right? So how do you know? You don't know. And if it is like it is, then she was an ape. So how can he be so sure? Well, he's sure because of the knee. You see, the knee is the one feature on this fossil that is human. And therefore, if the knee is human, then the hip is human, and the arm-to-leg ratio must be in between, and the skull must be ignored. Trouble is that the knee, and that they don't tell you, was never found with the fossil. The knee comes from other rock strata, totally different rock strata. And man and the apes were contemporaneous. The knee does not belong to Lucy. It wasn't found with Lucy. So if you take Lucy, what was she? 100% ape. So there are people that write in scientific journals which say she was probably something like a pygmy chimp. So what evidence is there for the ascent of man? What about the Neanderthals? There's a nice Neanderthal skull over there. A lot of these actually come from grave sites. And there is this one looking like, like a moron. Where does he come from? We know that this is the type fossil that they used was of an arthritic man, probably syphilitic, because you can see from the bone structure that there was a major problem here. So this is an old arthritic man with another social disease which changes bone formation. Interesting, their brain capacity was larger than yours and mine. So if anything, we've gone backwards. And here you have Australopithecus in the Museum of Natural History in Germany. They've put him in a suit. He looks perfect. So as far as he's concerned, he's 100% man. If you go to special fossilized remains like tar pit organisms like Grauballer man and Talon man over here, you find them buried with trinkets and with sun god offerings, so sun worship was very important. You will find that their throats are slit. This one here, for example, from ear to ear, so he was a sacrifice to the sun god. And interesting, some of these fossils are very large. In fact, they are meters tall. 2.5 meters is nothing unusual for some of these. So you have major problems here with size and retrogression and all of this. So what evidence is there for the ascent of man? When the Iceman was found, big excitement. Huge stories about Iceman found in the Alps. And then, deathly silence. Why? Because he was so ordinary. That was the problem. He was so ordinary. Or you find, like here, you have fossils, which are not really fossils. These are mummies from China. Perfect Caucasian people, just like any Caucasian of today. There's the female, 100% Caucasian. So just a few thousand years ago, there were Caucasians all over China. Let's ask science to reconstruct the evolution of man. So this is Scientific American. They tell you how it's done. Sometimes you find a bone chip. Let's say you find a piece of the skull. Let's say you find that top piece of the skull over there. And you say, okay, if this piece looked like that, then this looked like this, and that looked like that, and that, and you reconstruct the whole skull. They use forensic medicine. Now please, with forensic medicine you have the whole skull and you reconstruct what you see. Here you have a tooth and you reconstruct the whole skull. Or you have a bone chip or a piece of a jaw and you reconstruct the whole skull. You need a lot of mental energy to do that. And your mindset determines what your end product is going to be. This is no fun. Nebraska man started off with a tooth until they found the rest of the fossil and it was a pig. Remember that? So you really need a lot of mental energy. All right, they start with a bone chip or a piece of bone fragment, and then they put together a skull. Then they put on the flesh, and you have something like this. And then they put on the skin. And notice from this tiny little piece of bone, you can actually determine how long the upper lip is. Can you see that? And then you give him his expression, and you give him his hair, and you give him that dumb look. And that's your ancestor. And he's walking around like this. Not very bright. Why do they do that? Because it's not unfair. It's not unscientific. That's their mindset. The mindset is, I came from the primitive and I'm going to the advanced. And that's what you're going to get. So I'm not knocking them. That's what I would have done as well. But tell me, did you see this straggled hair and everything in the bone chip? Did you see the look in the eyes, that empty glare in the bone chip? Did you see it? Sure you didn't. And another thing that they do is they use asymmetry. Well, please remember that this is science, and this comes from Scientific American, so this is not pornography, and I'm very glad that they have this stick here in the very strategic position. I know that the female is not quite as covered over here, but they have horrendous models of what the ancestors looked like. If you take the females, they will have one breast that is tiny and scrunched up and one that is hanging all over the place, and they're totally asymmetrical. Symmetry makes for beautiful. All the top models, they've done an experiment or test to see what makes a person beautiful, and it's the symmetry. And what you have here is you have asymmetry. Now the Bible says God created man in his own image. Does the Bible say that? In the image of God, man was created. That's what the Bible says. Darwin comes along and he says man evolved from the beasts. And he came out of the slime pit and evolved over a period of time into the creature that he is today. So he has an animal origin, not an origin from above. Then comes Karl Marx. Karl Marx says, well, Darwin says we come from the animal. What is it that governs man? He was a great fan of Charles Darwin. Great fan. He says what governs man and the driving force that he has is his stomach. And to fill the stomach is the main purpose of any organism, because that's what it takes to survive. So economic driving forces for resources is what drives man, and whatever it takes, he will do it to gain it. So the stomach governs the man. Well, then comes Freud, and he finds the driving force a little bit lower down than the stomach. And he says, what drives man is his sexuality. Everything is geared by his drive for reproduction and offspring. And that is what determines man. God says that man is above his passions. He must rule his passions and not his passions him. So we have a total turnaround of everything that the Bible says. Bible says, when he made man, God said it was good. It was very good. And when he created Adam, and he put him down there, and Adam named all the animals, then he created Eve, and he looked at her. What do you think Adam felt when he looked at Eve? Well, his knees conked. And he was a goner from that moment onwards. Would you agree? So Adam was totally overwhelmed. If this had been what Adam saw, the sin problem would not have been a problem. Adam would still be running and he couldn't care what Eve did anyway, right? So we have a great controversy here. Either we had this noble origin, or we had this lowly origin. The one comes from above, the other comes from below. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 3 says, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts and saying, where is this promise of his coming? Ever since our fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Everything continues as it was always. That's the law of uniformitarian thinking. The past must be explained by the present. For this they are willingly ignorant of. Now let's see what they don't want. That by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water, and of the water, and in the water. So the creation account will be negated. They will be willingly ignorant that God created. Whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. What else will they deny? A worldwide flood. Does science do that? Science does all of these things. They deny creation. They deny a worldwide catastrophe. Why? But the heavens and the earth which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. The flood was God's judgment. Is that correct? Yes. On a sinful world. And God says there will come a final judgment which won't be by water, but will be by fire. Now, if I don't want to be subject to a God, and I don't want to be subject to a judgment, then I have to deny the existence of God. And if God has left so much evidence for a previous judgment, which would enforce a subsequent judgment, then people might come to their senses. So why not deny a previous judgment, and you don't have to worry about a judgment that's going to come? Does that make sense? So the whole aspect of the Godhood and everything he stands for has to be denied. Why? Because they are willingly ignorant. They don't want a God. There is no room for a God in their formula. When I was an atheist, there was no room for God. God didn't exist. Don't believe that atheists don't believe in anything. Atheists believe everything. Anything. As long as it's not God. Right? That's what atheism is about. You'll find atheists in the New Age movement thinking that they themselves are God. Isn't that right? You will find them in the spiritistic world playing and all these kinds of things. And talking with spirit mediums, that's fine. Working with their spirits, but please, no God. So the issue tonight is, either God's word is true, and then what else it says in the Bible is also true, or it is not true. The choice is yours. You can belong to this group that says there was no creation, there was no flood, or you can believe that thy word is truth.